For more than 4 decades, Judge Greg Mathis carefully built an image that millions of people trusted and admired. On television, he was a strong but fair judge who believed in second chances. In interviews, he spoke openly about rising from poverty and crime to become a symbol of redemption. Alongside him stood his wife, Linda Mathis, who was often described as the quiet strength behind his success. Together, they appeared to represent stability, faith, and family values. That is why the news in August 2024 shocked so many people. After nearly 40 years of marriage, Linda filed for divorce. The headlines spread fast, and social media filled with questions. How could a man who spent his life teaching lessons about responsibility and respect suddenly face the collapse of his own marriage? The answer, as it turned out, was not simple, and it did not happen overnight. It was a result of years of pressure, distance, public life, and personal mistakes that slowly cracked a foundation that once seemed unbreakable. When the divorce filing became public, rumors immediately began to swirl. Some claimed there was a secret child. Others whispered about relationships with younger women and long-term emotional neglect. Fans who watched Judge Mathis for decades felt confused and even betrayed. They were used to seeing him call out excuses in the courtroom, yet now he stood accused of failing in his own private life. Still, those closest to family insisted the story was far deeper than gossip headlines suggested. They explained that fame does not freeze time or protect marriages. Instead, it often magnifies stress. Long filming schedules, constant travel, and the pressure of always being on can quietly pull couples apart. For Greg and Linda, those pressures have been building for years before anyone outside their circle noticed. Understand how such a respected public figure reached this point. It is important to look far beyond the divorce papers. Greg Mathis did not come from comfort or safety. He was born on April 5, 1960, in Detroit, Michigan, and raised in the Herman Gardens housing projects, a place that was once built with hope but later became known for crime and fear. By the time Greg was old enough to remember his surroundings, the buildings were falling apart and danger felt constant. His father was absent, leaving his mother to raise 4 boys alone while working multiple jobs. Money was always short, and safety was never guaranteed. Violence, addiction, and desperation shaped everyday life, leaving deep marks on a young boy who was still trying to understand the world around him as Detroit struggled through the late 1960s and early 1970s. Herman Gardens became one of the hardest places to grow up. Drugs flooded the area, especially heroin, brought in partly by returning Vietnam veterans battling addiction. Crime rose, trust between neighbors disappeared, and fear settled into daily routines. Greg was exposed to this chaos early, and like many children in similar situations, he was pulled toward the streets. What began as small acts of survival soon turned into serious trouble. Arrests followed, then violence, then time in juvenile detention. By his teenage years, Greg's life seemed headed toward the same ending as many others from his neighborhood. Prison felt more likely than college. Failure felt normal. Yet even during those dark years, something inside him remained unfinished. The turning point came when his mother, already exhausted from years of struggle, faced a life-threatening illness. The fear of losing her, combined with the shame of disappointing her, forced Greg to confront the direction his life was taking. That moment did not magically fix everything, but it planted a seed. It showed him that change was possible, even if it would be painful and slow. That same belief in transformation later became the message that defined his career and made him famous. Decades later, when his marriage nearly collapsed, the public expected a simple answer or a clean villain. But life rarely works that way. Just as his rise from the streets to the courtroom was layered and complex, so was the breakdown of his relationship with Linda. The divorce filing was not a sudden explosion, but the result of years of emotional distance, personal struggles, and a heavy weight of living under constant public attention. To truly understand what happened next, it is necessary to follow the long path that shaped the man behind the robe, the fame, and the headlines. Growing up in Herman Gardens did more than surround Greg Mathis with danger. It shaped how he learned to survive, react, and protect himself emotionally. As a child, he lived in a constant state of alert, always watching who was around him and learning quickly that weakness could be punished. Home was not a place of comfort, but a fragile shelter that could be broken at any moment. One night, when Greg was still young. That fear became real in a way he would never forget. A man high on heroin forced his way into their apartment and attempted to attack his mother. The boys watched as the small sense of safety they had shattered in minutes. That experience burned itself into Greg's memory and taught him a lesson he would carry for years. The world was dangerous, and protection often had to come from strength, not trust. After that night, the family fled, but the places they moved were often even rougher, filled with gunshots, sirens, and tension that never fully disappeared. Greg's mother worked tirelessly, holding down multiple jobs while battling exhaustion and illness, but there were still nights when food was scarce and fear was constant. Greg watched her struggle and felt a mix of love, anger, and helplessness. He wanted to protect her, but he was still a child living in a world where power often came from the streets. As he grew older, school became harder to focus on. Violence followed him into classrooms, and learning felt distant compared to survival. Teachers tried, but the chaos around him drowned out their efforts. Eventually, Greg was pulled deeper into the street life that surrounded him. What started as stealing groceries to help feed himself and his friends quickly became a pattern. The line between survival and habit blurred, and crime began to feel normal by his early teens. Greg was no longer just reacting to danger. He was part of it. He became involved with local gangs, groups that offered protection, belonging, and identity in a world that gave him very little. Carrying a weapon felt like safety. Breaking the law felt like power. When he was shot at the age of 13 during a robbery, many would have seen it as a warning. For Greg, it felt like confirmation that he belonged to the streets. Pain became proof of toughness, and fear was buried deep. Arrests began to pile up, and juvenile detention became familiar. Each release came with promises of change, but the pull of the same environment dragged him back again and again. School systems struggled to keep him on track. Attempts were made to move him into different schools, to separate him from trouble, but geography could not erase influence. The streets were still home. Eventually, the pressure became too much. At 15, Greg dropped out of high school and soon found himself locked up again. His future looked narrow and predictable, shaped by statistics that rarely favored boys from places like Herman Gardens. Judges, probation officers, and teachers saw him as another name in a long list. Many assumed he would never escape the cycle. What made Greg's story different was not talent or luck alone, but timing mixed with consequence. While still on probation, he was given an opportunity to earn his GED through Operation Push, a program designed for young people society had nearly given up on. This chance came at a moment when his mother's health was failing. When she appeared in court and told the judge she had colon cancer and might not have much time left, something shifted. The judge looked at Greg and made it clear that the next choice was his reminder that the system would not always wait. Greg could continue down the same road, or he could try to build something else while he still had the chance. The weight of that moment pressed heavily on him. The thought of losing his mother, while still trapped in the same destructive life, terrified him more than jail ever had. For the first time, fear became a tool for change rather than destruction. Greg chose to pursue his GED, not because he suddenly loved school, but because he did not want his mother's last memories of him to be filled with shame. That decision did not erase his past, but opened a door that had long been closed. It was a first step in a transformation that would later inspire millions, even as it planted emotional scars that would quietly influence his personal relationships many years later. After earning his GED, Greg Mathis stood at a crossroads that many young men from his background never reached. Freedom did not feel stable or safe yet, but it carried possibility. He was still on probation, still surrounded by the same neighborhoods and people who had once pulled him into trouble, yet something inside him had changed. For the first time, he could imagine a future that did not end in a cell. 6 months after completing his GED, Greg enrolled at Eastern Michigan University. Sitting in college classrooms felt unreal to someone who had spent much of his youth moving between courtrooms and detention centers. He struggled at first, not because he lacked intelligence, but because discipline and trust were skills he had never fully learned. Still, he showed up day after day. He chose consistency over chaos, even when it felt uncomfortable. College exposed Greg to ideas he had never been encouraged to explore. Courses in public administration, politics, and social issues gave him language for the anger and confusion he had carried for years. He began to understand how systems worked, how laws were written, and how entire communities could be shaped by decisions made far away from places like Herman Gardens. This knowledge did not erase his past, but gave it meaning. Instead of feeling like a victim of circumstances, Greg began to see himself as someone who could challenge those circumstances. During this time, he also became involved in activism, using his voice to speak about injustice and police behavior in neighborhoods like the one he grew up in. For the first time, he was not running from his story, but using it. Balancing school with work was exhausting. Greg took jobs wherever he could find them, often working during the day and studying late into the night. There were moments when quitting felt easier than continuing, especially when money was tight, and his past still followed him in the form of court records and judgmental looks. Yet each small success built confidence. Passing classes, earning respect from professors, and seeing his name on college papers slowly replaced the identity he once had as a troublemaker. He was no longer defined only by what he'd done wrong. After completing his undergraduate studies, Greg made a decision that surprised even those who supported him. He applied to law school. For someone with his criminal record, this step felt almost impossible. The law had once been the force that punished him. Now he wanted to understand it from the inside. He enrolled at the University of Detroit Mercy School of Law, attending classes at night while working during the day. The schedule was brutal, but it mirrored the survival mode he had learned as a child. Long hours no longer scared him. He studied while others slept, driven by the belief that failure was no longer an option. Law school challenged Greg in new ways. The material was demanding, and the environment was often unforgiving. He was surrounded by students who had grown up with stability, resources, and guidance he never had. At times, he felt out of place, unsure if he truly belonged. But he leaned into his differences rather than hiding them. His lived experience gave him a unique understanding of the law's impact on real people. When discussions turned to crime, punishment, and rehabilitation, Greg spoke from a place few others could. His voice carried weight because it was grounded in reality. In 1987, Greg earned his Juris Doctor degree, a moment that symbolized how far he had come from the streets of Detroit. Yet success did not arrive smoothly. When he applied for his law license in Michigan, he was denied not once but 3 times. The same system he hoped to serve looked at his past and saw risk instead of redemption. Letters of rejection reminded him that his criminal history still mattered more than his accomplishments. Many people would stop there, convinced that the door was permanently closed. Greg refused to accept that outcome. Instead of walking away, he chose to fight. He prepared a detailed petition to the Michigan Supreme Court, gathering thousands of signatures from community members who believed in his transformation. He presented affidavits from young people he had mentored and support from respected public figures. His argument was simple but powerful. The law should recognize growth, not just mistakes. In 1988, his persistence paid off when the court granted him a license. That victory did more than allow him to practice law. It confirmed his life had truly changed and that the future he imagined was now possible. With his law license finally secured, Greg Mathis stepped into public life, carrying a story unlike any other. He did not hide his past or try to rewrite it. Instead, he used it as proof that people could change when given real opportunity. In 1989, at just 29 years old, Greg ran for Detroit City Council. His campaign was bold and honest, centered on police reform, fairness, and creating paths out of crime for young people who felt trapped by their surroundings. The media quickly focused on his criminal history, digging into old arrests and mistakes, but Greg faced the scrutiny head-on. He spoke openly about his past, explaining how it shaped his understanding of justice. Although he did not win the election, the campaign left a strong mark on the city. It forced uncomfortable conversations about police brutality and systemic failure, and it showed many young residents that their voices could matter. After the election, Greg's influence continued to grow. He became more involved with the NAACP, eventually earning a seat on its national board. His work focused on youth empowerment, legal education, and reducing the cycle of arrest and rearrest that haunted communities like the one he grew up in. In 1990, he took a major step by founding the Youth Empowerment Program. This initiative aimed to keep young people out of jail by offering mentorship, discipline, and support instead of punishment alone. Greg personally invested time and money into the program, even bailing out former gang members who had once been his peers. To many observers, this approach seemed risky, but the results spoke for themselves. Participants were more likely to finish school and less likely to return to crime, proving that belief and guidance could succeed where fear had failed. Greg's dedication and visibility eventually led to a historic opportunity. In 1995, at the age of 35, he was appointed as an interim judge of Michigan's 36th District Court by Mayor Dennis Archer. For a man who had once sat on the other side of the bench, the moment was deeply symbolic. Soon after, Greg ran for the position and won by a wide margin, becoming the youngest judge in Michigan's history at the time. His courtroom reflected his life experience. He was firm but compassionate, holding people accountable while still recognizing their humanity. Defendants saw a judge who understood the streets, not someone removed from their reality. As a judge, Greg introduced programs that challenged traditional approaches to justice. He focused on rehabilitation over punishment, especially for nonviolent offenders. He launched specialized courts that aimed to divert people away from prison and toward education, job training, and counseling. Critics initially questioned whether his methods were too lenient, but data showed otherwise. Recidivism rates dropped, communities stabilized, and many people who passed through his courtroom rebuilt their lives. Greg often visited jails, speaking directly with inmates, reminding them that their current situation did not have to define their future. His reputation grew beyond Detroit, and by the late 1990s, television producers took notice. They saw a judge who was not only authentic, but deeply relatable. In 1999, Judge Greg Mathis debuted on national television. The show was different from other courtroom programs. It mixed tough love with humor, life lessons, and emotional honesty. Viewers connected with him because he spoke plainly and drew from personal experience rather than legal jargon. The show quickly gained popularity, airing across the United States and Canada, and eventually running for over 2 decades. Fame brought new opportunities, but also new pressure. Greg became a public figure whose words and actions were constantly examined. He filmed hundreds of episodes each year, traveled frequently, and balanced television work with ongoing community involvement. At home, his wife Linda managed finances and helped maintain stability while raising their children. Together, they presented a united front, even as the demand of public life grew heavier. Over time, the balance between career and family became harder to maintain. The same drive that fueled Greg's success also pulled him away emotionally, setting the stage for challenges that would later surface in their marriage. As Judge Greg Mathis' television career flourished, his personal life unfolded mostly away from the cameras, shaped by long hours, constant travel, and the quiet sacrifices that often come with public success. Greg had met Linda at Eastern Michigan University during a fragile time in his life, just months after losing his mother. Their bond grew quickly, rooted in shared faith, resilience, and the hope of building something stable after years of hardship. They married in June 1985 and began raising a family in Detroit, while Greg worked his way through law school and early legal battles. Linda became the anchor of the household, managing finances, raising their 4 children, and providing emotional support while Greg focused on his demanding career. For years, their partnership appeared strong, built on trust and shared purpose. Their children grew up surrounded by discipline, structure, and love. Greg and Linda emphasized education, responsibility, and faith, lessons shaped by Greg's own painful past. As Greg rose in prominence, first as a judge and later as a television figure, the family adjusted to life in the public eye. Fame brought financial stability and opportunity, but it also introduced distance. Greg's filming schedule became intense, sometimes requiring him to record hundreds of episodes a year. Travel, appearances, and public commitments often pulled him away from home. Linda continued to manage the household and later helped oversee business decisions related to endorsements, real estate, and investments. Over time, the roles in the marriage became uneven, with Greg's public presence growing larger, while Linda carried much of the unseen work. Despite these pressures, the family remained largely private for many years. That changed in 2022 with the debut of the reality series that offered viewers a closer look at their lives. The show revealed family tensions, therapy sessions, and personal struggles that had previously stayed behind closed doors. One of the most emotional moments came when Greg and Linda's son, Greg Jr., came out as gay during the premiere. The revelation happened publicly, catching Greg off guard. Initially, he admitted feeling hurt that his son had not felt safe sharing such an important part of himself earlier. However, his response quickly shifted toward support. The moment sparked a nationwide conversation about acceptance within Black families and helped reshape how many viewers saw the Mathis family. Public response to the episode was intense. Ratings surged and discussion spread across social media, praise mixed with criticism. For the family, the attention was both affirming and exhausting. Their willingness to be open earned respect, but it also placed their private emotions under constant observation. At the same time, their business ventures expanded. The Mathis brand grew into a multi-million-dollar enterprise, with Greg continuing his courtroom show and the family exploring new partnerships. On the surface, everything appeared successful. Yet behind the scenes, emotional distance continued to grow between Greg and Linda. In the years leading up to 2024, Greg faced several public controversies. Incidents involving accusations of heated confrontations and disputes drew headlines, even when no charges were filed. While these situations did not end his career, they added strain to his public image and personal life. Each headline brought renewed scrutiny and stress into the household. Linda, who had long acted as a stabilizing force, felt the weight of constant crisis management. According to later statements, the issue was not a single scandal but years of emotional neglect. The marriage had slowly shifted from partnership to parallel lives. In August 2024, Linda filed for divorce. The decision surprised the public, but not those closest to the couple. The filing cited emotional distance and exhaustion rather than dramatic betrayal. Rumors of affairs and secret children quickly flooded tabloids and social media, though many of these claims were never proven. Greg denied several of the more extreme accusations, but acknowledged that he had failed to prioritize his marriage. The filing marked a breaking point, forcing both Greg and Linda to confront long-ignored issues. For the first time in decades, the image of stability they had presented cracked openly. What followed, however, would surprise many and reshape how their story was ultimately told. The weeks following the divorce filing were some of the most emotionally difficult of Judge Greg Mathis' life. For a man who had survived prison, violence, and public scrutiny, the collapse of his marriage felt uniquely painful. Greg later admitted that the separation hit him harder than many of the challenges he had faced in his youth. For the first time in years, he was forced to slow down and confront the emotional cost of a life spent constantly in motion. Linda moved out, and the physical separation made the emotional distance impossible to ignore. Friends close to the couple described both of them as exhausted, not angry, but deeply hurt by years of unmet needs and missed moments. During this period, rumors continued to circulate online, fueled by speculation and tabloid coverage. Stories about secret children, long-term affairs, and hidden scandals dominated social media. Greg publicly denied several of these claims, calling them false and exaggerated. However, he did not deny that mistakes had been made. In interviews and later public appearances, he acknowledged that an inappropriate relationship had occurred and described it as an unplanned failure in judgment. Linda later confirmed that while the affair hurt, the deeper wound came from emotional neglect and years of feeling invisible within the marriage. Their honesty shifted the narrative away from sensational gossip and toward a more realistic picture of long-term relationships under pressure. Instead of allowing the situation to spiral into a bitter legal battle, Greg and Linda chose a different path. Both entered therapy, individually and together, confronting issues they had avoided for years. Therapy forced Greg to listen rather than lecture, a role reversal that challenged his identity as a public authority figure. He began to understand how his work, while meaningful, had consumed his emotional availability. Linda, in turn, focused on reclaiming her own sense of identity beyond being a wife and manager of family affairs. The process was painful, requiring accountability, forgiveness, and uncomfortable honesty. Within 3 weeks of separation, something shifted. The space created by distance allowed both of them to reflect on what they still valued. Nearly 40 years of shared history, children, faith, and mutual respect weighed heavily against the idea of walking away completely. By the end of the 3rd week, They began the process of reconciliation. The divorce proceedings were paused, and the couple committed to rebuilding their marriage with new boundaries and expectations. When they later appeared together on a national talk show, their body language told a story of cautious hope. They held hands, admitted their failures, and spoke openly about the work required to heal. Greg compared the pain of the separation to the loss of his mother, describing it as a grief that forced deep self-examination. Linda spoke about learning to prioritize her emotional health and stop carrying the burden alone. Their public honesty resonated with many viewers, particularly older couples who recognized similar patterns in their own relationships. Instead of presenting a perfect resolution, they framed reconciliation as an ongoing process, not a miracle cure. Following their reunion, Greg and Linda turned toward faith-based mentorship and community work. Together, they launched programs aimed at supporting young men raised by single mothers, drawing directly from Greg's own upbringing. They shared their story not as an example of perfection, but as a warning about neglect and a reminder that success does not replace presence. Greg openly told men not to sacrifice their marriages at the altar of ambition, a message that carried weight precisely because it came after failure. By the end of 2025, Greg and Linda stood together again, changed by the experience. The scandal that once threatened to define his legacy instead became another chapter in a life marked by falls and recoveries. While public opinion remained divided, their decision to confront the truth rather than hide from it added depth to Greg Mathis' long-standing message. Redemption, they insisted, was not reserved for courtrooms or criminals alone. It was a lifelong process, available even to those who believed they had already learned all the lessons life had to offer.